I was kind of wondering where to start on this, the murder of Una Lynskey and who killed her, but I think maybe start in 1971 and a little bit of an idea what the country was like then, because people just can't understand how unusual this was and where it happened, of course.
Yeah, you're talking about 1971. I mean, it was a completely different country to the one we're used to today. Very much dominated by the church. You had something like 95% of the population consider themselves Catholic in a census, 91% attendance at Mass.
God.
Yeah, it's very different. Crime was very low. The Garda Commissioner's report for 1971 had 13 homicides, 9 of those classified as murder. And the types of murders they were like you would have had domestic violence that ended up in a man killing his wife. You would have had a dispute between brothers. You would have a drunken fight. Neighbours was another one. But all compared to today, very straightforward. It's an agrarian society. We hadn't yet joined the EC as it then was, which of course became the EU.
I wasn't yet born.
Yeah, Nicola, I should have known that. I was, but I was more worried. I had far more pressing issues than anything like that at the time. But and for instance, the average income in the country is about half what it was in the UK. I think now we're probably more than what it's in the UK. So it was really, the way I describe it in the book, it was kind of a backwater. It was a state 50 years after independence that was still waiting to take off. And even the 60s and all the changes that were there in the likes of Europe and the US, people say the 60s arrived here in the 70s, which I think is what it did. But change was coming, but it was coming very slowly. 1971 was also the year John Charles McQuaid died. He was the Archbishop of Dublin who dominated anything he felt came within the church's sphere over the preceding 30 years, including the writing of the Constitution with Eamon de Valera. So you had those changes coming, but it was still pretty much a backwater.
And a quaint sort of a society, really.
Very much so.
People lived simple lives. Now, Una Lynskey's 19 years of age and she's from a large family. She lives in a very tight-knit and very rural part of County Meath, which is no longer rural because Ratoath is very built up and it's a commuter town now.
Yeah, I mean, up there, I've been up there numerous times in the last couple of years, but it really struck me when I went there to count the number of houses. And what you had then was I think it was 19 homes there, very small homes by today's standards with very big families. Today, I have it in the book, I think it's 80 plus houses, very big homes, nearly all I'd suppose, and I'd guess with small families. And very prosperous because it's kind of a long reach commuter belt out there. I'd say the houses are pretty expensive, so it's a completely different area. The most defining feature about it in 1971 is that the majority of all the people there were from families displaced from the West. Now, the people who caught up in this, Una and the 3 lads, their parents had all come over from the Belmullet area of County Mayo under a land commission programme. And that involved people who were over there in what they were described as congested areas, which effectively were holdings that were too small to make a living out of.
Okay.
The government had a scheme whereby they would voluntarily, they'd ask those people, do you want to come east? We've bought an area here, small holding, 20-25 acres. You've a chance to make a living for yourself and your family. Huge numbers took that up.
So do you mean when you say that it was that the families had passed down and they divvied up the land or the farm so many times when the kids were, say there was 5 in a family, that they'd each be getting a part of a farm, and what was left then after generations of this were tiny little holdings you couldn't make a living with?
That was an element of it, but what also was an element of it was these holdings had only really come into the possession of what had previously been tenant farmers under the land wars of the 1880s, and they were very small anyway.
Right.
And they were just not viable. And no, there was a lot of hostility towards them in the East when they came over, principally, by the way, to Meath and Kildare. To this day, you've Gaeltachts in Meath. There is a result of people who came over here under that land commission programme. And so most of the community, and they'd come all from the one area, the Belmullet area, the state had bought a big estate around Porterstown Lane in 1941 and used that to divide it up between families coming from the West. And I think it was well put by one of the people I spoke to there, Mary Conmey, who'd be a sister of Martin when the lads got up in it. She said to me, when she first went to school, she was amazed that the other kids, their parents weren't from Mayo. She thought that's just the way things were. Everybody's parents were from Mayo. So that's an indication of the community that lives in. Una Lynskey's father, Patrick, was speaking after the incidents to do with the book. When he was talking to the guards, he said, we came over here, he said, the Meath people never did us any harm, but they never accepted us. So that was the kind of...
So it made them an even more insular community, yes. is the point of this when this happens to Una. They're not... So it's small anyway. They're living in this... sort of an area of farms. You said there's only 19 houses. Everyone knows everyone.
Yeah.
And they're very tight and probably going back generations, they know everybody. Una has a job in Dublin and she gets the bus.
Yeah, ironically in the Land Commission, which was the agency that brought them all here. So it just happened she got a... Now, Porterstown Lane at the time, Nicola, half of it was populated. Those 19 homes were practically all in one half of it, a cul-de-sac where Una's family lived, and the other half was unpopulated. The half that was populated led onto the Navan Road. Mm-hmm. The half that was unpopulated led onto the Fairy House Road, right beside the famous racetrack there. Now, anybody who was on the road who was getting a bus into Dublin would go to the Navan End Road, the popular area, because there was far more buses. Una, and it was to be faithful for the poor woman, went the other way. And the only reason she went across the unpopulated half of the lane was because her cousin Anne lived on the Fairy House Road. And Anne had begun a job in Dublin. Prior to that, Una went with all the others to the other side. So Una and Anne were effectively the only two from the lane going for a bus at that end of the lane. Anne lived, as I say, on the Fairy House Road, just at the end of Porterstown Lane. So they got that bus in, just the two of them. They were very firm friends every morning. On the morning of 12th of October, they were late for the bus. So Anne's father, Pat, got out of bed and gave him a lift to another bus and they went into town. Normal day, as things were, Anne did her day's work. She finished. She got in the bus back home. She met Una did her day's work. She met Anne gone on the bus. Anne had kept a seat for two friends out in the bus all the way home. They get off the bus between 10 to 5 to 7. Normally they chat. They'd stand there chatting for a good while, but it was getting cold. The winter was coming in. It was dusk. Anne said goodbye to Una. Anne lived just down the road. Una took off across the lane. And that was the last anyone ever saw of her alive.
And the alert was sounded almost within 30 minutes. I think her father went looking for her, which is incredibly fast, for somebody to... She obviously was she regularly came home at the same time and the father was worried.
And like the very first thing they did, her mother, Winnie, told one of her sons, will you shoot over to Gahans, who were their cousins, and see, has Una stopped with Anne? Did she go to Anne's house instead of coming home? So the brother went over, and when she wasn't in Anne's, that was the first sign of alert. There's something wrong. She should have been home 15 minutes after getting off the bus. Then one of Una's sisters were married on the lane to a man named Redden. So they went there and thought maybe she called into her sister. No sign of her there. Now they were getting really worried. All this was within half an hour. At that point, they decided to go to her boyfriend's house. He lived up near Ashburn, about 8 miles away. And they went up there. It was heading for 7 o'clock, I think, by the time they got up there. He was stunned. He hadn't heard from either. Tom might be there. He went back and helped them look. And their first thing was, let's go to the guards. So Paddy Kelly, the boyfriend, said he'd do it. He went into Dunshaughlin, alerted the Gardaí, and then a search began for her.
Now, presumably, given the low crime figures and all the rest of it, they weren't immediately worried that she had been snatched or that somebody might have taken her. Was it probably the more concerns was that she had wandered into the fields, that there might have been some sort of an accident?
Yes, there was that. And there was also a feeling, remember we were talking about the Ireland at the times. One of the big issues at that time, of course, was anything like birth outside of marriage. And there was this trail of young women who went to England for abortions or still at that stage into mother and baby homes. Remember, an awful lot of those young women, it wasn't perhaps known in their community that they'd been pregnant. So that was one of the things that people began to think locally. Not just that, but the Gardaí alerted authorities in the UK to be on the lookout for a woman of her description on the basis she may have gone there. All of which is totally, understandable at the time. So there was a feeling of that. And I suppose you have to ally that to the hope that the unthinkable hadn't happened, that she'd been somehow snatched off the road there on the Porterstown Lane.
So how long did it take for what we call the heavy squad or the Garda's then murder squad. Were they even called that at the time? I know they were loosely called that at the time. How long did it take for them to be brought in?
They were brought in within 48 hours, which was early. Like at that stage, it certainly wasn't clear yet that somebody had taken her, had kidnapped her, whatever. It certainly wasn't clear. But they came in that early and immediately they set to work, and their main work was questionnaires and taking statements from everybody and anybody who was around at the time, who was out at the time. Now, one of the first things that came to their attention was a number of people on the lane or in the vicinity of the lane. Number, for instance, were out getting cows. Una's uncle Pat, who'd driven her to the bus that morning, was out putting a bucket down a well near his home when he heard the scream. Like, that's really poignant if that was Una. He was after bringing her to school or to work that morning, and then he hears this. Others heard a scream.
At what time?
This was about heading for 7 o'clock.
So minutes after she would have left Anne.
Yeah, I'd say within 10 minutes of her leaving Anne at the most. So around that time, a number of people heard a scream. Their descriptions were similar as to what the scream was. There was also a young, who were cousins of one of the people involved by coincidence. There's a lot of cousins in the whole area. But there was a young boy and girl who were out with a dog at the time, and they were imitating the dog's bark. Now, the Gardaí ascribed that to people hearing the scream. Other people have grave doubts. They think there really was a scream. But that was one of the first clues that something had happened to her. The other one was the sighting by a number of different people of a strange car in the lane that evening. The car, most people deduced, was either a Zephyr or a Zodiac. They were models of Ford that predated, I think, the Executive, and might have been the Cortina, one of those bigger Ford cars. They were used by government agencies and all now, the Zephyr and the Zodiac. So a number of people saw one in the lane at the time. They saw a middle-aged man driving it. The three boys who became suspects of the Gardaí, they entered the lane at the far side from Una on their way home from work. They were in a car, Dick Donnelly, his car. He was with Martin Conmey and Marty Kerrigan.
Now this is the Navan Road side.
That's the Navan Road side, exactly. So they entered that, and they say they entered that at about 7:10, which now would be between 15 and 20 minutes after Una had left for her short journey home. They dropped off Martin Conmey. They carried on, and then subsequently, the two of them who were left in the car, Dick and Marty, maintained that they passed a parked car. Dick says he thought it was a Zephyr. Marty thought it was a Zodiac. And that was parked near an area called the 3 Acres. And they went on. Now, that was also a sighting of this strange car. In time, not too long a time, within a week, the Gardaí would come to believe that they invented that sighting.
Now, they were 19, 20 and 22 themselves. They were young men. None of them had any sort of a history of anything. There was no suggestion that there was any animosity between them and Una. Una's a woman, 19-year-old girl who's in a relationship. I think maybe there was a little bit of, maybe the family didn't particularly
her
like that relationship.
Yeah.
But nothing really strange.
Oh, no. Her look, the Lynskys had done very well for themselves. They'd worked hard. They were very diligent. And Una got the impression, and Winnie Lynskey said herself after, she would have preferred if Una was going out with the way Una described it, with someone who worked in an office. But Paddy Kelly was, in fairness to the young fella, he was a hard worker himself, and he was somebody who was ambitious. But the parents, or the mother in particular, wasn't crazy about the relationship, but there was nothing more to it than that.
And he completely had an alibi because he was 8 miles up the country.
Oh yeah,
within minutes.
He did, and subsequently he was very close to the Lynskys. He helped them in every sort of way, to the point that he was with them on the fateful night when somebody else was killed. But there was no question of him having anything to do with it.
So the murder squad guys, now there must have been an awful lot of news about this at the time because it was such a huge story. Also, the murder squad would have had sort of an attitude that they come in and they solve something. I mean, that would later emerge, really, wouldn't it? So they're kind of almost putting pressure on themselves, but they go in and they decide that these 3 guys, that Dick Donnelly, Martin Conmey and Marty Kerrigan, are their suspects.
Yeah. That
they're telling lies about seeing this other car, and they hold them in.
Yeah, I mean, you could say in a broad sense 2 possibilities. One, follow what this strange car was. That would have involved a bit of dogged police work, but it certainly wouldn't have been beyond the police. The other possibility were these 3 lads had come in a car. They were the only other suspects that were there in terms of a car at the time. Number of people were on the lane. They were all accounted for. They were the only ones with a car. And for whatever reason, they got into their heads. These were the 3 they were looking for. For instance, one of the other people was a cousin of Una's that had seen this strange car with the man in it. The Gardaí showed up at his house for a photo fit, and they had a sketch artist, and they got him to draw a sketch. And according to him, subsequently, Pádraig Gahan, he said, one stage, you're saying, do you think that looks like Dick Donnelly? And Pádraig was saying, that's Dick Donnelly's. That's Dick Donnelly's a young fella like me. That's not Dick Donnelly. But even at that point, it would seem, they had determined they were looking. What they did, to my mind, Nicola, is they decided who was guilty, and they built the evidence around that. And that was one example of how they appear to have gone about their job.
And they obviously proved themselves to do the same later in the Kerry Babies case and the Salins case. They, it is done across the world, maybe in not such democratic societies nowadays, but it is a form of corruption, really, when police go in and they decide who's guilty and they make every piece of evidence fit. It's hard to believe that they were given the carte blanche, really, to do so, but they were held up, weren't they, the murder squad? They were seen as the elite.
Yeah, and I suppose you have to put it in the wider context. You're talking about the early 70s. The concept of human rights was coming into Western society. The idea that police forces did not always act as they should have was also coming in. You had, for instance, in the UK, in Australia, in the US, issues of corruption being uncovered within police forces. Famous one, of course, subsequently turned into a movie of Frank Serpico, who's still alive, by the way. I interviewed him once. You had that sort of thing going on. There was a problem here. One, the Gardaí, apart from being the police force, were also in charge of security of the state. That's highly unusual for a police force. Normally it's a separate agency. Two, as we mentioned, there's an agrarian society, low crime rate. That was what their knowledge of crime was. Then the North explodes. You have the professional IRA, the provisional IRA, who were very professional, who had nominally at least an objective of overthrowing the state. They were very aware of forensics. They would ensure that any witnesses would not give evidence. So the guards had a tough job on their hands at that point, and said to me later, they would have seen themselves as being at the front line of securing the state. Either it evolved or someone made a decision or whatever, but it would appear that somebody came to the conclusion that if we want to get these fellas, we need to get confessions. If they're not going to give confessions, we need to extract them. So I think there's very little doubt that crept into the policing among a group loosely known as the Heavy Gang. And apart from dealing with the security of the state, and that obviously is wrong anyway, and it's breaking the law, notwithstanding the circumstances, but then it would seem that those tactics were used in what you might call ordinary crime, as in non-political. Una Lynskey being one at one end of the scale, where this happened 13, 14 years later. The Kerry Babies, another example at another, and there was a few others in between. So that seems to be how they got away with it. And we should also remember, the government was informed that this sort of thing was going on, and they did nothing. The judiciary were not informed it was going on, but when you look at some of the evidence, if they didn't have their suspicions, they certainly didn't voice them. So there was a sense of impunity, but it went beyond the Gardaí. And it should also be noted that an awful lot of Gardaí within the force were uncomfortable with it. Their knowledge of it, the rumours of it, they didn't like it. They felt it went beyond the pale. But that's what it was, and it seems there's very little doubt, notwithstanding people saying it didn't exist, that culture was there at the time.
And I suppose really, if we're looking at the culture, we should also look at the investigations techniques that they had, because this is all pre-technology.
Yeah.
So, this was boots on the ground policing that should have been done. But you would think from a basic level, they should... Do you not need a motive there? And there was no motive whatsoever with these 3 guys.
No. There's no motive. Not only that, the way it appears to have evolved is they seem to believe one of 2 possibilities. One, that Dick driving the car either as a prank that went wrong or by accident or whatever, hit Una, knocked her down, rendered her unconscious at least. They panicked and they took away the body. How plausible that scenario is, I don't know.
And hid it somewhere.
And
they had no eyewitness accounts of this car going off later that evening. Yeah.
Not yet. They eventually thought they did in terms of people changing statements under pressure, but that was one possibility. The other was they met Una, they offered to give her a lift home. Now, she wasn't that far to walk now. And she got into the car and something happened. She banged the head, she was assaulted, something happened. And again, they took off with her. Within the context of their theory, as I call it in the book, they weren't suggesting that there was an attempt to sexually assault her or anything. They were more of the idea that something went wrong. But as I say, there wasn't a scintilla of evidence that any of them met them. There was no circumstantial evidence to put them there, particularly in relation to timing. Yet that's the line they pursued.
And of course, tragically, this set the community upon one another. And obviously, you can imagine the tensions. And 2 months after she went missing, Una Lynskey's body was discovered up in the Dublin mountains. And that's when things went really tragically wrong.
Yeah, I mean, after 2 weeks, they brought in the 3 lads to Trim Garda Station and a fourth, Christo Ennis, whom, again, with zero evidence, they got it into their heads that Una's body could have been buried in Christo's family property because Christo was a friend of the boys. There was zero evidence. They let Christo go fairly early. They kept the 3 of them. 3 boys always maintained they were severely assaulted, intimidated. Bits and pieces of confessions were beaten out of them, which they say, and with a lot of evidence to back it up, were just done because that's what the Gardaí wanted them to say. As you say, then another 6 weeks after that, Una's body was found. And ironically, I mean, for instance, the Marty Kerrigan's sisters were telling me, of course, they were devastated. The poor woman, she obviously was dead. She was a neighbour. But another part of them felt relieved because they meant now at least they'll be able to find out who actually did it. That's not what happened. What happened is within 10 days, one night there was a street fight between the 2 factions. Marty Kerrigan was dragged into the car of the Lynskeys and one of the Gahans. He was brought up the Dublin mountains near to where Una's body was found. And his body was found there within hours. The 2 Lynskeys and John Gahan maintain always that he was alive when they left him, that they didn't intend to kill him. Now, in the subsequent trial, it came out that there was a wound to Marty Kerrigan down his groin, which suggested there was an attempt to disembowel him. Crucially, the pathologist, and it was not challenged, said that wound happened after his death. Notwithstanding that, the jury in the trial found him guilty of manslaughter and they were sentenced to 3 years in prison. Which
seems very short.
It does.
Yeah. Given the nature of that. And in the meantime...
It seems very short, but again, I kind of referenced this in the book. Did the jury and the judge by extension, these were 3 lads who normally would never have been in trouble. Did they factor into account that they believed they were avenging their sisters and cousins' death and things got out of hand? And that may have fed into the verdict. It may also fed into the judge's
That there was an understanding, you mean, from the jury that, that this guy deserved it?
Effectively, you could say that, yeah. Or at least that these 3 believed he deserved it and that they were overcome with emotion, having been bereaved, and Una's body just having been found 10 days earlier. Now, that didn't form part of the evidence, but we're all human and you don't know how people are going to react in scenarios.
And this is such a high-profile case that there's not a
exactly, and all of that would be predicated on the basis that the 3 lads believed, and by extension, the jury would have accepted that Marty Kerrigan was guilty, which, of course, he was not.
I wanted to ask you, when Una Lynskey's body was found, was she clothed?
She was. She was clothed. Her body was decomposed, so it wasn't possible to determine the cause of death. How they identified her initially was, and Paddy Kelly had been her first boyfriend, and she had been very much in love, and he'd given her 2 gifts over the preceding 6 months, a ring and a watch. And she was identified by those when the body was initially found, but they couldn't determine the cause of death, and there was nothing either that they could determine in any event to suggest she'd been sexually assaulted, but I think it was just that the body was so decomposed it wasn't possible to do so at the time.
We can suspect she may have been, as much as we can, but today there would be geographical profiling and all the rest of it. But was this where she was found near a road? Was her body dragged? Was it tossed from a
the way it was found and the place it was found in would suggest that somebody went up there with the body and made a kind of a crude attempt to hide it. But quite obviously it wasn't hid very well.
Mm.
It was found by 2 council workers. One of them saw these bushes that appeared to be cut so that they didn't appear to have just fallen down. And they thought perhaps there might be a dead sheep under there, that somebody with a dog, was trying to hide up that the sheep had been attacked.
Mm.
And unfortunately, when he uncovered it, then he found the human skull initially, and that was the body.
And does the direction of the body from where she disappeared tell us anything at all?
No, it was 40 kilometres away. It was up in the Dublin Mountains. This, as we know, was down in Rathote. So,
was it the nearest spot that was remote, isolated?
I suppose geographically, you go from Rathote, okay, you'd be talking about going to Rathfarnham, which is kind of in the southern suburbs. And that's how they brought Marty Kerrigan, actually, subsequently, through Blanche in. You go over to Rathfarnham and up the Dublin Mountains. Is it a place? It's hard to know. You could be going across the Dublin Mountains to go somewhere. You could be familiar with it through being a resident close by. It's very difficult to put clues on.
Of course, you think of a woman's body being dumped up the Dublin Mountains, and we think to more modern mysteries, and some of which have been linked. Is there anything going on in Ireland around this period of time that is possibly similar?
It doesn't appear so. I mean, it was highly unusual for something like this to happen. We didn't have a scenario like that we did in the last 10, 15 years of one individual being suspected perhaps of attacking and murdering a number of women. There was nothing of that nature there at the time. In fact, the idea of a woman being kidnapped and disappearing like this was practically unheard of.
And you're probably hitting the 1980s before you have any sort of case that's ringing similar.
Yeah, easily.
So tell us what happened then, because I'm after interrupting you there and bringing you back.
No, you're correct. What happened? Well, then, as I say, Marty Kerrigan was killed. The first trial was that for the Lynskeys and John Gone for Marty Kerrigan. The second trial was for Dick Donnelly and Martin Conmee, charged with the murder of Una Lynskey. At that, a number of people who'd given statements changed them at the trial, which immediately gives rise to the question as to why, but that wasn't explored. The earlier statements were not produced. Sorry, when I'm talking about statements, that was a feature of it. You had a number of statements given by witnesses. For instance, there was a school teacher, Mary Collins, who walked across the length of the lane as she did every evening for a walk, sometimes with her pram, sometimes not. On this evening, she went across, herself and another woman, Kathleen Gahan, met, and a car passed them going down the lane, similar to the car was seen by others.
Right.
That's the only car she saw. The Gardaí went back to her a second time. She might have seen a car coming back up the lane, which would have fitted the Garda theory about the 3 lads, she said in the second statement. And there might have been hairy fellas in there. The lads were young fellas, they had long hair and that. And she said, but it could have been that day or it could have been the day before. Mm-hmm. So, you think of that, Nicola, it's suggestive of I'm telling you, well, did this happen? Are you sure? Are you sure it didn't happen the day before? It could have been the day before. So next year, writing down, it could have been that day, it could have been the day before. So the idea of these lads having come up the lane is introduced into the narrative, even though it could have been the day before. Mm-hmm. A third statement was taken from her, where it was no longer could have been the day before, it was the day. And not only were these fellas with a lot of hair, she identified the car as Dick Donnelly's. So you had a progression of statements that conformed to the theory that the Gardaí had. And with each one, you had no explanation as to why the previous statement was different, which would be the obvious thing. You didn't say that. How come you didn't say that the last time? You know what I mean?
And we've seen that repeatedly during their trials. With repeated witnesses.
Well, that happened with 2 other young fellas, Sean Donnelly and Martin Madden, who gave evidence. They changed their statements. It happened to some extent with a man, James Donnelly, who had spotted a car. He was brought up to the Phoenix Park 3 or 4 times and repeatedly asked, is that the car? Until he finally said it was. So you had a number. Now, despite that, you also had a voir dire trial within the trial to determine whether admissions made in custody could be put before the jury. And that was where all the allegations about assault in custody came out. Very little of that was heard by the jury. Some of the admissions were. So at the end of the day, or let me put another way to you, I couldn't see a trial today being conducted the way that one was and having an outcome. In any event, the outcome was 2 lads guilty of manslaughter. Now, hold that one sec. If the jury believed, based on the evidence, that these 2 fellas had encountered Una, she had been killed as a result, they had buried the body, and they pretended they knew nothing about it. If a jury believed that, one would have thought you'd nearly have to convict of murder. If a jury didn't believe that the evidence amounted to that, normally you might suggest surely they would have just said not guilty. If they said not guilty, then that would suggest that these two lads' friends, the trial for whose killing was conducted a month before this, that he'd been an innocent man killed. So again, I know it's a dangerous thing, but you go into the minds of the jury, and did they reach a kind of a compromise to themselves in saying, well, it doesn't look like they murdered her, but they must have done something because you look at what happened. Do you know what I mean? So it ended up a manslaughter verdict. At the appeal, Dick Donnelly got off because he hadn't made any admissions.
No, they had no cause of death.
No, did no cause of death. The pathologist said it was very unlikely that she'd been hit by a car. That's the one thing they were able to determine. Dick Donnelly got off an appeal. Martin Conmey was sentenced to 3 years, the exact same sentence that the three who'd killed his friend Marty Kerrigan had been sentenced to 2 months previously, and he served that term in prison in Mountjoy.
And subsequently, they cleared their names.
Many years later, 2010, he got it back into the Court of Criminal Appeal. He was helped by a private detective, and that overturned the conviction. And not only that, he got a certificate of miscarriage of justice, which is a higher standard again, which suggests not that he was getting off, to use the term, on a technicality or anything, but that there was actually a miscarriage of justice there. And he was compensated by the state for having to spend that time in prison.
But it's an extraordinary window into a period of time and into the consequences of bad policing.
Absolutely, completely. It really is.
I mean, that community was turned on, it just turned on itself, really.
Yeah.
And presumably was destroyed after it with those neighbours and all that happened.
When the Lynskys moved out, they were part of that close-knit community. They'd come from the West. They moved out within 18 months of the lads going to jail. They disinterred Una's body and brought it with them over to County Kildare and subsequently County Carlow. So, quite obviously it had a massive impact on them, and they lost Una. They lost one of their own. Back in Porterstown Lane, you had the stain over Martin Conmey in particular, and Dick Donnelly to a lesser extent. You had the Kerrigans who'd lost Marty. Yeah. Their father on his deathbed was crying out, "Don't let Katie," who was another daughter, "get into the car." He quite obviously was, his mind was at a stage where one of his children were being bundled into the car. It was Marty, his son, rather than his daughter. So that haunted him for the rest of his life. So it was devastation. And I mean, we mentioned the Kerry babies. Look at the Kerry babies. If, for instance, the baby that was found in Carsavine had the same blood type as either Joanna Hayes or Jeremiah Locke, the couple who'd been having an affair, if that baby had the same blood type, they could have ended up charged with murder, which would have been unthinkable.
Yeah.
And they were just lucky in that sense. So you can see the devastation that can be there by...
There's a very sort of visual thing about Marty Kerrigan, of course, because there's witnesses that see him being bundled into the car. He's brought up to that mountain and then he's discovered in that place. We know, you can imagine the fear that he had, the anger and the emotions that were in that car. You don't see anything visually with Una Lynskey. It remains, if we go back to the basics of it, it's a very bizarre disappearance. It's like as if she disappeared into thin air.
Very much so. As you say, like the only image that I would have in my head, and it was very well described by Anne Gahan, is you're there at dusk. They're a bit cold. Anne said that it was the shortest time they ever spoke after getting off the bus because the winter was coming in. You have Anne about to head off. Una turns and walks to the lane, and Anne described Una as looking lovely in that instant. And these two very close friends. And that's the only image you have of her. And the next image is that awful, horrible one of her body being discovered 2 months later. And as you say, that's very true. There's nothing visual.
In between.
No,
visual
you see, and that is really...
And it sort of echoes a little bit of the case of Mary Boyle in Donegal, a completely different, obviously, Mary Boyle's body was never found, but it's that sort of country idyll that, 1 minute they're there, the child is crossing over through the bog after a relative, and the next minute she's gone. And then there's these whispers of a car in the area, but they can never quite establish that there was a car or a van in the area. This mystery remains, and
it does, and they're in their own environment, and there's no reason in an ordinary sense for anybody to be worried about anything, and suddenly something happens.
And it's sort of like almost a series of sort of sliding doors moments. If people looked one way, they'd miss.
Yeah.
You know, this predator perhaps came into that area and snatched her, and everybody happened to be looking the wrong direction at the time, or maybe just catching small glimpses of the car. Having said that, if the police had done a better job at the time, they could have followed the trail, couldn't they?
Well, that's the thing. And again, that idea, Nicola, of the police, and as you said, it happens in other jurisdictions, honing in on a suspect and building the case around it. Once they do that, they close off, not necessarily intentionally, but just purely in terms of their focus, they close off any other lead. And, you know, sometimes those leads, you don't have to look too far and they could have brought you somewhere, but they completely close off every other lead. And that seems to be the case that happened here. When you do that, the prospect of eventually...
and people don't come forward who saw something else.
Or if they do, they're ignored.
Yeah.
Because as far as the guards are concerned, this is what they saw. Even in terms of those who did see somebody, this middle-aged man, as I said, the guards were approaching people and saying, "Is that Dick Donnelly? Are you sure it's not Dick Donnelly?" Do you know what I mean? So even in that instance, they've decided who was responsible, and it leaves devastation.
Now, in 2023, it was announced that the Garda's Serious Crime Review Team, or the Cold Case Unit, is going to reinvestigate this case. In actual fact, they don't investigate. The Serious Crime Review Team, they go over all the statements, they look at the files, they go through everything, any of evidential value that might be, you know, things move forward scientifically with time, and perhaps DNA strands are found or whatever in investigations, and they give back a kind of a list of recommendations to an investigation, to a murder investigation team. They don't necessarily do the murder investigation themselves, but they have been looking at this for the last year. I mean, it must be one of the oldest cases they have ever been asked to.
I think it is probably
review.
the oldest. Yeah. I mean, they're faced with a difficult task on two fronts. One, the idea of picking up any lead or developing a new lead at this stage is going to be extremely difficult 50 years later. Who has died? People have died. Records missing, whatever. On the other hand, they also, in doing so, because remember, they're also looking into the death of Marty Kerrigan as a result, they also have to examine whether their colleagues broke the law, whether their colleagues beat up suspects in custody, whether their colleagues were involved in organised perjury in the trial that followed the trial of Martin Conmey and Dick Donnelly. And at no point in the history of the so-called Heavy Gang and the murder squad from the 70s into the 80s has there ever been any investigation into their activity.
So is that part of the remit of the series?
No, not necessarily. But if you're looking at it,
you can't.
If you're looking at how and they are examining Marty Kerrigan's death, if you're looking at how Marty Kerrigan became a murder suspect, I can't see how you can avoid any of those things. So, you know, to step around daintily around that will be very difficult. And
is there anybody from, so that's 50 years ago, so anybody who would have been actively part of that murder squad or the original, those detective team, are any of them alive?
There's one individual alive who was really peripheral to this case. He would have been present when one or two of the lads were brought in, I think, and I think he gave evidence in 2010 Court of Criminal Appeal, but he'd be very peripheral to it. To the best of my knowledge, he's the only Garda that's still alive. John Courtney, who was central to the whole thing, died, I think, in 2017. He would have been the last of them, I think, to die. But he was central. He gave evidence in 2010, and he was completely unrepentant and completely stuck by the story that he had preceding, gone back 40 years before.
Well, we saw the same thing in the Kerry Babies affair when...
he was involved in that.
Yeah.
As was Jerry Carroll, who's now deceased. And John Courtney was involved in Salins as well. So he was involved in another case of Christy Lynch, an off-duty soldier who was accused of murdering a woman in Sandymount in 1976. And Courtney was central to that as well. And there, the Supreme Court said that in custody, the suspect had been beaten up, and that rendered confessions null and void. So he had a long record also of positive service to the Gardaí, but he had a record of this stuff too.
And should that not be held as something separate? That have we ever had this squad that were involved in so many high-profile cases examined, looked at?
No. There's currently a campaign that has been running for years by a man, Oscar Brannock, who was, along with Nicky Kelly, initially convicted of the Sallins mail train robbery in 1976. He has brought a campaign. He's had it endorsed by people like former Judge Pat McCartan and others. The UN have endorsed it, the ICCL, the Irish Council for Civil Liberties. He is looking for an investigation into what happened in that case. So far, there's been resistance. No one has gone along with it. But there's never been a proper investigation. Like the Kerry Babies Tribunal probably set up as being the closest thing to it. But as we all know, that went from, it was initially set up to find out how a family who could not have known about or been involved in a murder came to confess to a murder after spending time in custody. That's what it was set up to examine. It ended up examining something completely different. And it never seemed to touch on those issues. So there hasn't ever really been an investigation into what went on during what was a pretty dark period of policing.
For sure. Who Killed Una Lynskey, a true story of murder, Vigilante Justice and the Garda Heavy Gang by Mick Clifford. Michael Clifford, you have yourself on. You're not Mick.
Call me Mick, so call him Mick now.
Michael Clifford's on the. Oh, you're Mick Clifford on the.
Yeah, well, that's it's been. I don't know what to call myself anymore.
But anyway, book is on sale now. Do you have any hints? Do you have a theory in your head? What happened?
There's one individual in the book who a distant relative came forward to me who had suspicions from the time, fitted the car, the make of the car, fitted the profile, subsequently was imprisoned for assaulting a woman, went to race meetings, and we know there was Fairyhouse Racecourse, even though my research there was no race meeting that week or the previous week. That's a possibility. Other than that, I don't, but the thing is, Nicola, with all these things, you have conspiracy theories immediately abound, not least a typical one, and I've heard this, for instance, in relation to Sophie Duplantier as well. A guard was involved. No, there's no reason to believe that for a second. Other people suggest the murder squad purposely deflected from something else. I've no reason to believe.
There's a big conspiracy.
Yeah, I've no reason to believe that to be the case. So it's very difficult at this point, and the point you made it very well, the visual aspect of that. She disappeared. There was a car in the locality. Who was that? And at this remove, in fact, when there was the investigation by Billy Flynn, the private investigator, he thought he knew the individual, and one of the people who'd seen the man in the lane that day was brought to see him. And he reckoned it was him. But that was 25 years later. So, and the investigation into that individual didn't go any further. He's now dead. So it's very difficult to pinpoint someone. And it would be very difficult for any cold case review to come up with someone. I'd love to see if they did or if they came close to it.
And it'd be interesting to see going forward if they look at certain crimes that happened in the 1980s against women and, women and any other victims who've shown up in the same sort of dumping grounds, as they're known as, up in the Dublin Mountains, because, somebody could have in 1971 been jailed for something else and not got back out till the 80s, of course,
That is very, very, very possible, very possible.
Because it is just to snatch a woman off a roadside is such a rarity. It's probably what all women fear.
Absolutely.
But irrationally.
Yeah. And for the times in particular.
Exactly, yeah.
It's very difficult to know where it could go in that regard.
Well, look, it was a brilliant book. And as you said yourself, you should have written it many years ago because you've been on the story for so long. But that's, I think, what gives the book the intimacy that you have with it,
Yeah, as I say, it's a story I've been doing a long time. And hopefully it'll bring some solace in particular to the Kerrigans who really feel that their brother, his memory, has been tarnished by the fact that when he died, the Lynskys thought he was a murderer. They were induced to think so, and he was innocent, and he died because others thought so, and that some gesture can be made in his memory to wipe away that stain.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mick Clifford, thank you very much.
Thanks, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.